Okay, Exodus chapter 20. We'll start with verse 14. You shall not commit adultery. What do you think about that?
Pretty straightforward.
No? In a sense, how so?
Thou shalt not commit adultery. To me, that's just very straightforward.
Okay. What does it mean to commit adultery, I guess?
To me, it's to not have sex outside of your marriage
Okay.
of any kind.
For whom?
To me, both man and woman.
Okay. Any other thoughts on this?
Well, in the New Testament, how about you would have anything in mind?
Yeah, don't even think about it.
Think about it or say it, you know. And they always blame the woman, no matter what.
Well, we'll look at that pretty soon. But you are not far wrong there, that's for sure.
Well, back here in the Old Testament, they would always say don't commit adultery, but the men were allowed to marry because they had parents, you know, hundreds of wives, or several wives. I mean, even our Old Testament characters had one or two or three wives, you know, and, but if the woman stepped out of line, she was executed probably.
Well, that's true. There's absolutely a double standard culturally, and I think that is reflected in the Bible as well. That women and men are not treated exactly the same in terms of, particularly in terms of sexuality, in the Bible, and that's a challenging component of Scripture or aspect of Scripture for our contemporary audiences, especially. I think maybe the general thing we can take from the double standard, if you want to call it that, is a recognition of what is, I think, an absolute truth, which is that in terms of sex, men and women have different vulnerabilities and different levels of investment in what's happening. That sex is inherently different for women than it is for men. And our culture has tried to, I think, kind of level the playing field to some extent. But in doing so, I believe they have gotten to the point where they have denied some basic realities. And when you try to make it exactly the same for both parties, it doesn't really comport with the truth. It does. I mean, there's just you end up with a lot of, I think, strange things, and you certainly end up. We talked a little bit, not that much, but a little bit about the abortion issue in terms of the commandment about you shall not murder, you shall not kill. One of the arguments in support of abortion rights is that men have historically been able to, again, have sex with whoever they want and then walk away from any consequence from it. And the woman is left dealing with the consequence, and abortion is one way in which she can kind of bring herself back up where she doesn't have the consequence that so many men have not had. Now, I'm not making that argument because that's what I think it should be. But
even at that, they still deal with the consequences of adultery. The abortion. We hear about what these women deal with after that. It's not just being able to walk away clean after that either. So they,
certainly,
again, to re-emphasize your point, they carry the baggage with them.
Yeah, that's just the truth. And it's not, and we're not, let's take the morality or the emotional component out of it. Physically, certainly depending on the procedure and what they have, the different,
The mental aspect of it.
but then you do, I mean, the emotional and all of that is still there. Just from a physiological standpoint, they have to undergo a medical procedure that the man doesn't have to undergo. So that's the kind of the argumentation that it doesn't. It somewhat levels the playing field between the two. Some would say it goes beyond that, and now the woman can choose, and the man has no choice in whether or not he is a father. And then there's responses back and forth on that, so I don't want to get too bogged down in that. But I think that argument, and I think this argument to some extent, on this issue, this commandment realizes, I believe, that there is inherently a difference between men and women in terms of what is at stake when they come together sexually. That the woman is vulnerable in a way the man simply isn't. And it isn't just pregnancy going forward. It is the social stigma attached. And it is also maybe more likely to be not just pregnant, but maybe contract a disease or something like that. The man may already have it. The woman is less likely to give it to a man than the man is to give it to a woman. So there is this inherent difference between the two. And it's understandable that I think to give people the benefit of the doubt, it is understandable that they want to shrink that difference. And we have, to a large extent, I don't think too many people in here would have disagreed with Dahlia's statement that this is, don't either party have sex with anyone other than your spouse, male or female. Nobody here would really disagree with that. As I mentioned in your handouts, that is not how it was understood by the original audience, the original recipients of the law, because the original recipients of the law were really all men, for one thing. And not that women weren't under, they certainly were. But even the ethic is a little different. I mean, our ethic on marital fidelity is about building a trusting, healthy relationship between two people that will endure for time, and mutually nurturing and combining the fate of your life with someone else, that you're going to be tied together in every way. And to have that work the best is to be completely faithful to one another. That's not how marriage worked back then. I mean, marriage was an arrangement arranged by the parents, and property considerations were enormous. Women were property, particularly their sexuality was property. We get into the supplement. I printed off the supplement for those who want the supplement and aren't on my email list or whatever. If you're not getting my handouts, I'm happy to give them to me if you want them. I don't like to use paper and ink printing things out for people who don't want it. If it just clutters up your house and you don't want it, I understand that. The old law talks really a great deal about human sexuality. And it's important to understand some of these other passages, I think, when we look at what it means to not commit adultery. And in this context, it would not have meant for a married man to visit a prostitute. It would not have meant for a married man to, find a paramour somewhere out in the world, perhaps a divorced woman or a widowed woman that was not able or inclined or whatever, was not his wife. That's a shocking kind of thing to us today. It seems very unfair, but that's the culture that they were in. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as it unfolds. Deuteronomy chapter 22 is kind of I think it's these, again, these are not exhaustive, but they give us kind of the clearest view of the culture around human sexuality that existed in ancient Israel. Yes, ma'am.
The one thing though that we have to remember that in New Testament times, it goes even farther. It's a mental attitude that is just as bad as doing it. And where best I can tell in the Old Testament, that mental attitude toward it for doing it wasn't there. But in the New Testament, even if a man looked on a woman to lust after her, he's committed adultery in his heart already.
Well, again, yeah, there's some complexities there. Covetousness of a neighbor's wife is, you could say, included in the 10th commandment. So, and when I think Jesus is talking about do not covet or do not lust after a woman, he is talking about a wife. And that's one of the Hebrews, one of the kind of aspects of the Hebrew language. A virgin was an unmarried woman, a woman who had never been married. It did not necessarily refer to a woman who had never had sex. And absolutely 100% of the time, it referred to a woman who had never been married. And you didn't become a woman until you were married. The word for wife and woman in Hebrew, my understanding is they're the same. So when you look at a woman, you're looking at a wife. And again, this goes back to a lot of what the Lord's saying, the property rights. And in Deuteronomy chapter 22, and this is in the supplement to the handout, we have the basic law. And these are basic laws. This isn't viewing every possible way in which sexuality can be exploited or misused by anybody and under any circumstance. But Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 13 through 21, to summarize those verses, this is basically the law on consensual premarital sex, and it mostly applies to girls. It is about a girl who is still in her father's house, a virgin, young woman, still in her father's house. And her sexuality is the property of her father. He gets paid for it, not for him to exploit himself, but he gets paid for it when he sells her to her husband for the bride price. So for her to have premarital sex is to commit a property crime against her father. There is no corresponding idea or concept in the Old Testament that when a young man has premarital sex, extramarital sex, that he is cheating on his mother.
You just asked for those.
Yeah.
That's okay for guys.
It is, I mean, that idea lingers, doesn't it, though?
Yes.
Absolutely, it lingers. We still look at these things differently, and we still kind of even celebrate them to some extent. I didn't grow up around it. I didn't see it. Maybe some of y'all participate in this or not, but there are these ceremonies in some gatherings where the little girl kind of marries her father in a sense, pledges her sexual purity. She won't do anything until she gets married. She gets a purity Bible. She gets a purity ring. And her father is I think it's weird. I think it's really weird, personally. But that's my view of it. And again, in our culture, there's absolutely nobody would say that something like if a teenage boy is fooling around, he's cheating on his mom. Nobody would think that. I wouldn't think. So there is this concept, this idea that the daughters, in a sense, belong to the fathers because they will sell them, get the bride price when they get married. And the sons belong to the mother because the sons will care for the mother when she is in her advanced years, presuming she's younger than her husband, and her husband will probably die first, and when she's old, her sons will take care of her, particularly the eldest son will take care of her. So when we see in the Bible the miraculous conceptions, like Sarah, like Rebecca, like, I guess you could say Rachel, like a lot of Hannah, even Elizabeth and Mary, it's always a boy. Every time God intervenes in a woman's life to give her the capacity to conceive and bear a child when she was not able to do that before, the child that is born is a boy every single time. And that's one of those things that when women look at this, contemporary women look at this and say, this proves the Bible is sexist. It is sexist in a sense. It's sexist in the sense that it treats the sexes differently. But the laws overall are intended to protect the vulnerable. And in this culture, and I think even in our culture, women are inherently more vulnerable than men. And the ethic behind all this, the moral behind all this, is designed to protect women more than it protects men. And, that kind of is shocking, I think, when we get into Jesus talking to the Pharisees, but we haven't gotten to that yet. So if a girl living at home fools around with a boy, she has dishonored her family. She has robbed, in a sense, from her father. She has played the harlot, and the punishment is stoning to death by the men of the city or the men of the camp. There's no corresponding punishment for a boy. It's just different. It is completely different. The adultery that is punishable by death of both parties is for a man, any man, to have sex with a married woman. And they are caught, it says sleeping together in New American Standard. They are caught, as in John, the woman caught in adultery, in the very act.
But it takes two,
It absolutely, and it takes, no, Dolores, it takes three.
well,
It takes a man, a woman, and a husband.
yeah.
I don't know if y'all remember, it's been 3 years now. But my tryout sermon here was about the woman caught in adultery. And people all the time ask, where was her partner? Why is he not there on trial too? And that's a fair question. But let's face it, it's a sexist society. And if you think they're going to protect the woman because they can't punish the man, you're crazy. You're naive. The question is, where is her husband? Because every single time adultery is committed, a married woman sleeps with someone besides her husband. The man may be married, he may not be married. But they're supposed to both be put to death under those circumstances. In verses 23 through 27 of Deuteronomy chapter 22, a betrothed girl who has sex with someone other than the person to whom she's betrothed, who will be her husband, has been involved in adultery. The man who has sex with this betrothed girl is said to have violated his neighbor's wife, even though they're not technically married yet. Maybe she's not of age yet. Maybe they just haven't gotten around to it yet. Now, where do we know a story where that came, kind of that topic, that prospect came up? With Mary, right? Mary was betrothed to Joseph, not married yet, betrothed, and turns up pregnant. So Joseph says, I'm going to put her away. He's an honorable man. But one of the interesting things about Deuteronomy, the story there is, well, where did it happen? Where did the encounter happen? If it happened in the city, it's consensual because she didn't fight hard enough. She didn't cry out where people could hear her and come to her rescue and protect her father's interest, protect her future husband's interest. It must have been she playing the harlot, her playing the harlot. So she gets executed as being an adulterous wife, even though she's not even married yet. If it happened out in a field, it must have been rape, because it wouldn't have mattered how much she yelled and fought, scratched, whatever. Nobody was there. Nobody would have heard her. No, if she's out in the field, she's innocent.
If she didn't cry.
No, you will do nothing to her. It doesn't matter if she cried out on the field. The setting determines the outcome, according to Deuteronomy chapter 23 through 27. Again, these are kind of general. Even this, it's not quite as general as the Ten Commandments, but it's still pretty general. I'm not trying to say there's no exceptions or nothing else that would come into resolving the issue. But if it's out in the field, it is considered to be rape. If it happens in a city, if it happens in the camp, it's considered to be consensual. If it happens in the city, they both get put to death. If it happens out in the field, only he gets put to death. Adultery, though, in this is considered murder. It is a property crime, to be sure, but it is equal to murder. And we'll look at that more when we look at the 10th commandment. Now, all this sounds, I think, pretty difficult, pretty tough, particularly on young women. Well, it gets harder. It doesn't get easier. Verses 28 through 29, an unbetrothed virgin who is, I use the term in the handout, ravished. I guess the more politically correct term would just be raped. But you could use it as some people, historically at least, have viewed kind of less than ideal sexual encounters with some amount of nuance, and others do not. It's either consensual or it's rape, one of the two. So if you want to consider it rape, that's fine. But if she is not betrothed, she gets bought by the guy who raped her and becomes his wife, and he can never divorce her. So if your teenage daughter is raped, she marries her rapist. How do you like that law? Well, he can't ever divorce her.
Well, he can't ever divorce her.
They can really mistreat her.
And we didn't mention it, but the first story, the promiscuous young lady, if it's proven that she was not promiscuous, the husband that accuses her of being promiscuous is now bound to her for life. He can't divorce her either.
But
So-
why would she want to stay with him after he accused?
It's not about what she wants. That's the long and short of it.
Any say in what they do.
Yes.
Isn't that actually the idea that then she has somebody to take care of it because on her own,
Yes.
she has no rights, no ability to take care of herself?
But that doesn't mean he's gonna take care of it.
No, I agree. But
Okay.
I'm just saying that-
He's legally obligated to, though.
He's obligated to, but whether he does or not.
Yeah. And we'll get into that a little bit more. But yeah, so it's it just kind of keeps getting, in a sense, you could say, worse. But again, there is nothing like this for men. But because, and Robert kind of got us in this direction, once a woman has been with a man, she is considered unsuitable to be anybody else's wife, really.
Maybe he'd learn to love her. Who knows?
But so she is taking from her father, and now she has ruined herself in a way that she is, I mean, she can still have sex with men, but she can't be married. She's unsuitable to be a wife. To be married and have children with one man and over time and have him take care, that is off the table. That is not going to happen.
A woman's.
Her life as a woman is gone. So even if she isn't stoned to death, basically, there's other stories like that. There's a story in the Judges of a young lady whose father foolishly says, I'm going to sacrifice the first thing I see when I get home to the Lord as a burnt offering. And the first thing he sees when he comes home, his daughter. And she weeps for her virginity. And a lot of people say, well, that means she was cloistered. He didn't really kill her. He was cloistered. I don't think so. I think the story is to be understood as he sacrifices her. And because she's weeping for her virginity because it means she never got to be who she was supposed to be. Because every girl born is to be a wife and a mother. And if you're not a wife and you're not a mother, then you have no point to your existence. And think about all the women we have in the world today that maybe never get married and never have kids, but are just treasured members of our society and culture. But this is harsh stuff. And it goes into understanding what it means to not commit adultery. And if we don't see that yet, maybe we'll tie it up here in a little bit. In this case, we've already talked about adultery equals murder. Having premarital relations with an unbetrothed girl does not equal adultery or murder. You aren't put to death for that. You are forced to marry her.
Maybe that's where she's at.
Depends on, she's got a lifetime to get back at him that way, But it's still very difficult, and we're kind of making fun a little bit, but this is real, and it lingers. Like I said, it really does linger. When you go to a wedding today, who gives the bride away? Normally her father or some other male authority figure in her life. And who insists on that? Do you think the groom is really cared who gives her away? Does the groom care what color the flowers are? Does the groom care what music is played or something? Does the groom care about any of it? Robert said yes. He was very particular. He wanted a lavender suit, and that was going to be the
I'm just talking about the ceremony. The ceremony itself should have some meaning to both.
It should be.
It should. And in a lot of cases, it does.
Yes.
So all I'm saying is, yes. When Connie and her mother decided to commission her there, her mother made it, and she helped her, and they did all the flower arrangement. Was that all? No.
No.
But I participated in it, and it was quite a wondrous thing to go through that type of ceremony, where it's a church wedding, where everything about it is trying to bring man and woman together.
But nobody gave you away, did they?
Yeah, my fault.
Yeah, okay. But a long time before then.
He's all yours now.
No.
So that's what I'm saying. And the more I look at this, in my thinking, I might be wrong, so you correct me, but the laws, yes, because the woman was considered property. There is no question about that. But if a man, and we have many examples of that, of where a man wanted to have a wife, and he worked so many years for it, but he got her sister instead. Worked some more years and finally got it. But he still had a responsibility. And I think that's what we're seeing here. That even if the woman does lose certain things, a man is causing it. It's not the woman causing it. Now, there's other issues that you could look at, but in general, the man has a responsibility towards that, either woman, virgin, non-virgin, if you really look at it. He's the one that, what would you say, is the final responsibility. Because the woman at that point in time in history had no responsibility.
She has no power.
Yeah, she was.
And you could say it's, it's also, we looked at this a little bit when we went through Genesis, but when you look at Sarah giving her slave to Abraham, who is Sarah to give her slave to Abraham? What about her right, the Hagar's rights? Where Rachel and Leah give their slaves to Jacob. Yeah, they didn't have any rights. So when we look at that, we look in our own national history, we see the slave owners here. You don't think they had sex with their black slave? They very much did. And if they had a child with that female slave, guess what? That child was a slave. And the female slaves would frequently nurse the white babies. I mean, this is the evils of. So, but we need to kind of move on a little bit. There is this great discrepancy of power. Women are more vulnerable. Robert is right to point out that God is putting responsibility primarily upon the men. And that brings us to Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4, which is the Mosaic law on divorce. And it concerns a wife who finds no favor in her husband's eyes, for whatever reason, it seems like. And that's the question. What does it mean to not find favor in your eyes? That law has been understood historically by Christians and was certainly understood by the Jews as a way, an opportunity to rid yourself of an unwanted wife. I can just give her a certificate of divorce and send her on her way. But when we get to Jesus interpreting these laws, and this is, we've already kind of hinted at this, the passage in Matthew chapter 5, verses 31 through 32, which is about divorce and all that, is really the overall, fits in with the overall message of the Sermon on the Mount, which is, you have heard, but I say. And it does contend, you have heard, do not commit adultery. I say, you do not lust after a woman. Matthew chapter 5 says that if you give them a certificate of divorce, it is because you are required to do so, not because you are entitled to do so. And that the only reason you can do that, what it means to not find favor in her husband's eyes, is that she has committed some form of sexual immorality. You have no other grounds to divorce her. But and Jesus talks about it, because of the hardness of your hearts. The reason that they had to have this, they had to issue the certificate of divorce, is because otherwise they could just put the unwanted wife out of the camp. Technically, she's still his wife, but he's not taking care of her. He's not feeding her, clothing her, sheltering her. He's taking her kids from her, and they just leave her behind. Now, what's she supposed to do? What is one of the few ways an unmarried woman can support herself in an ancient culture? Being a harlot, being a prostitute. And let's say she does that, or she finds some other way to support herself, and she amasses a certain amount of money, and here comes her husband again, and she's got a pocket full of money. Well, that's his wife. That's his money. Oh, we're making Alma mad right now. But he could just take that money. It's his wife. So they did not have, God is protecting her, saying, if you're going to send her away, you give her a certificate of divorce, with the possibility that she might remarry. Maybe she'll get married again. One thing she absolutely cannot do once you've given her a certificate of divorce, she cannot marry you ever again. And maybe this never happened here, I don't know, but I've heard it in plenty of churches of Christ growing up. When a couple splits up, maybe even if they've remarried, both of them, they are supposed to divorce their current spouses and get back together. Because that's God's love for marriage. That's what he wanted. You didn't get married for the right, or divorced for the right reasons. So you're in adultery with your spouse now. You got to get back together. That's absolutely prohibited. That's an abomination before the Lord. To remarry the woman that you sent away. And in all the context so far, and as we get into the later chapters of Matthew and in Mark, parallel passage in Mark, all of this is still the man divorcing the wife. In Jewish culture, the idea of a woman divorcing her husband it's like saying when aliens land on the moon and start eating it up because it's all made out of cheese. It didn't happen. And it was not. Now, Mark 10 verses 1 through 2 kind of raises that possibility. And we'll talk about that in a second. But Matthew chapter 19 verses 3 through 9, once again, Jesus interprets the Mosaic law about marriage and divorce to the Pharisees. And they don't like it one bit. They don't like what he says. We've looked at these things and we've all concluded that these are very pro-man rules in a pro-man culture. And the first century Pharisees said, it ain't pro-man enough. It needs to be even more pro-man, meaning I can send her away for whatever reason I want. I have the right to do that. And it was never a right. It was an obligation. It was something you had to do. If you're not going to be her husband, then you have to give her a certificate of divorce so she can go out and make her own way in the world, maybe get remarried, maybe start a business, maybe do something and acquire some wealth. And probably what would never happen is her being taken back into her family, her family of birth. They didn't want her around. They couldn't sell her again, so she's just another mouth to feed. But even Jesus' interpretation in Matthew, at least, doesn't seem to have any idea or cognizance of a woman divorcing a husband. It just doesn't really appear to be on the culture. We do find that in Mark. What we don't find in Mark is any mention of adultery as a trigger for divorce, that becomes an excuse for getting divorced. Now, I don't know how you choose to reconcile that slight difference, or maybe even a substantial difference between Matthew and Mark, where Mark says no divorce, no marriage under any divorce under any circumstances, and Matthew says in the case of adultery, you can put her away, you can give her a certificate of divorce. Sexual immorality, you can give her a certificate of divorce. The Gospel of Mark, for the most part, is a very tight, fast-moving gospel. It was probably the first one written and went out into the world, out into the Gentile world. It's kind of bare bones in a lot of ways. At times he stops and he goes into tremendous detail. But for the most part, he doesn't go into a lot of detail.
Jack Webb consulted on this, just the fact.
Yeah, it does. Mark doesn't have the birth of Christ. And maybe even the original text doesn't have, there is a resurrection story and all of that on Mark at the end, but it looks really much like it was added on later on. Like they kind of pieced together maybe all three, Matthew, Luke, and John, and put stuff together and made that the ending of Mark. And I think the idea of this woman divorcing her husband, going into the Gentile world, by the time the gospel gets there, You may have found cultures in which women could divorce their husbands. And so the translators, the writers, or whatever, the transcriptionists, I think faithfully say, well, if the women have the right to do that, they're under the same requirements that the men are under. First Corinthians 7, which is a huge chapter, a lot of things going on there. We're not going to try to exhaust that. But verse 15 talks about a believer married to a non-believer. The non-believer leaves. It doesn't say the non-believer leaves them for someone else. It says the non-believer leaves. Let them go. You are not under bondage. Some would say still, you can't remarry. But if you can't remarry, are you not still under bondage? You've been abandoned by your spouse, male, female, whoever. And Paul does contemplate the idea that a believing man would be left by his unbelieving wife. So, tying this kind of all back in to the original commandment, I think it makes this commandment really a lot more, in a sense, we end up kind of where Dahlia started us, but at the same time, we have to go through this lengthy process because that's not how they would have understood it. But I think it's the biblical principles have impacted culture, and I think we do see it more or less that way now, a mutual sharing, a mutual honoring. But that mutuality exists in this, but it exists directed towards fellow male Jews. And if the negative commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery, the positive corollary is, thou shalt honor the marriage of your neighbors. You want your marriage honored. You don't want your neighbors sleeping with your wife. Don't sleep with their wives. Don't sleep with your hired hand's wife while he's out in the field working all day and you go visit his tent. Love your neighbor as yourself. You don't want it happening to you. Don't do it to them. And again, this does tie very much into property. And, you know, there's a big movement right now that there's really no such thing as private property. You don't own anything. But that is a very anti-biblical look at it. Because particularly in the Ten Commandments, property is identity to a large extent. God gave them their land as an inheritance. And when God gives you an inheritance, nobody can take it away. You can't even sell it in perpetuity. When you sell your land, it comes back to your family eventually. That's why the wife of noble worth considers a field and buys it. It's not an easy idea. How long am I going to have it? When does it revert back to the family? And if it's going to revert back to the family, you want it to actually revert back to the family. Revert back to the true children of the husband, not a child born by the mother, but with a different father. You start getting all kinds of social chaos when you have all this going on in a very structured world, a culture built on honor and a culture built on property, where you are, to some or a large extent, what you own. Why was Abraham a great man? He had faith, but he also had a whole lot of flocks, a whole lot of herds, a whole lot of slaves. You don't want someone messing with your lineage. Don't mess with theirs. You don't want someone creating chaos in your home. Don't create chaos in theirs. And I think that we could take that principle certainly into the modern context. That marriages, I mean, there is plenty of chaos in marriage anyway, isn't there? We don't need to add to it and bring to it more to it. So again, as I say in the supplement, this is not an exhaustive discussion of human sexuality in the Bible, but it does go to show what they meant by adultery, because what they meant by adultery impacted on when they could divorce, when they had other rights, and why maybe at times they would divorce an adulterous wife rather than have her stoned. You had to kill someone, you had to have 2 or 3 eyewitnesses, right? So maybe you only have one. Maybe she, in a fit of anger, confesses to it, but nobody saw it. So you can't stone her, but you can divorce her. Yes, ma'am.
David certainly committed adultery with a woman, but these rules didn't really turn out for him.
Well, that's an interesting point. The David and Bathsheba story is it shows, first of all, though, that the king was not exempt, because he was scared when Bathsheba became pregnant. He tried to cover it up. He tried to have Uriah sleep with his wife. He eventually had to have Uriah murdered so he could take Bathsheba into his home. Bathsheba has no real capacity to withhold consent from the king. The king has sent for her. Her husband's not even a national. Her husband is a Hittite, Uriah the Hittite. So it cost her the son of David, right? The son of David died for that sin. And in that story, I don't have the passage right here. Before the son dies, Bathsheba is Uriah's wife. After the son dies, she's mourning, she's grieving. David goes in to comfort his wife, Bathsheba. And the child she conceives is Solomon, the next king of Israel. So, yes, all this stuff, all these punishments, it all sounds horrible. But the human reality is we have this ideal notion that a young boy grows up and doesn't sleep with anybody until he gets married to a young girl who has not slept with anybody, and they don't sleep with anyone else their entire lives. And that's a great aspirational view of the world.
And that's God's intent.
It is the ideal situation. It is not what happens most of the time, certainly not in our culture. They were sexualizing the children, to be sure, from birth. The boy is going to take care of the mother. The girl is going to get sold. They're creating strife between the genders right off the bat. Look at our own culture and how we're sexualizing children right now, and how we've done it for really a long time. They still do it. They dress girls up, little girls, and put them in those beauty pageants, and they wear makeup and they wear bikinis and they dance and shake it and all that stuff. Look at what happened to JonBenet Ramsey. We sexualize children. And now, rapidly, it is crossing it's not just about sex anymore, it's about gender itself, isn't it? But we're so much more advanced than they were back then. And we're doing a lot of it under the guise of it has to be completely equal. Everything has to be equal. Men and women have to be equal. Transgender has to be equal. Everything's the same. So I would say the ultimate story of David and Bathsheba, the ultimate point of that story with Solomon's birth is that God can redeem anything. That God can go into the most horrible of sins, adultery, murder. I think David rapes Bathsheba, really. I mean, she can't say no to the king. If she can't say no to the king, how can she say yes to the king? You know, that's the whole point of date rape. You drug someone, they can't say no. They can't say yes either. An underage person can't say no. She can't say yes. Bathsheba can't say no. Well, then how can she say yes? You have all this going on, conspiracy, all this stuff. And God brings Solomon out of it. And we put limits on God's power to redeem. There are no limits to God's power to redeem. He can redeem the worst garbage we bring him. He can bring good out of it. It's not his intent. It's not his intent to sell your brother into slavery. But he can bring good out of that. It's not in his intent for a father-in-law to deceive his son-in-law as to who he's going to be married to. He can bring good out of that. So our brokenness, our sexual brokenness, is something, again, once into it, God can bring good out of. As bad as it is, as much as the dangers and the cultural chaos that can be brought about, the personal chaos. And this is all very personal, isn't it? I mean, this is why at one point a public figure caught in a sex scandal was done. I mean, you were done. Not anymore. At worst, you're off TV for 6 or 7 months, and then you're back. It's the world we live in now. And I don't know which is worse. But, I mean, to brand someone a certain way and they can never overcome their mistakes, or to basically say it wasn't a mistake in the first place. That's how human beings deal with stuff. It's either one or the other. God says neither, but here's what we're going to do about it. Okay. Hi, Kim. Glad you're here. And I know that wasn't very much fun. I know it's hard to deal with these topics. So thank you for your attention and your comments. And Mr. Cole, will you lead us in a closing prayer, please, sir?